If you want to understand why this moment is different, you have to understand the architecture that made it possible. And that architecture wasn't built overnight. For roughly 3 decades, Iran and Israel have been locked in a conflict that most people never see directly. Foreign policy analysts call it a shadow war, not a war of open declarations and uniformed armies, but a war of proxies, intelligence operations, targeted killings, cyber attacks, and carefully measured escalations. Each side understood the cost of going too far. Each side, for most of that period, preferred the conflict to stay in the shadows rather than erupt into something that could spiral beyond control. Israel's Mossad sat at the center of that strategy. If you know anything about intelligence services, you know what Mossad represents. It is routinely assessed as one of the most capable and operationally aggressive intelligence agencies in the world. Its reach extends from the Middle East into Europe, South America, and beyond. Mossad doesn't sit in offices and read intercepts. It acts. Scientists working on hostile nuclear programs have been assassinated in their own countries. Nuclear facilities have been sabotaged in ways that took years to fully understand. Hostile governments have been infiltrated at levels that weren't discovered for years after the fact. For decades, Mossad operated with a kind of institutional invincibility, the sense that it could project power almost anywhere, and that its own house was untouchable. Iran, watching all of this, made a decision early on that it could not compete with Israel or the United States in conventional military terms. The American defense budget alone dwarfs Iran's entire economy. Israeli air power and intelligence capability are backed by decades of American technology transfer and direct military aid. And the story you're being told about what just happened between Iran and the United States is incomplete. Not because the facts are hidden, but because the framing is wrong. This isn't a Middle East flare-up. This isn't another chapter in a familiar cycle of tension and de-escalation. What unfolded in the last 72 hours is something different in kind, not just in scale. It is a stress test of the assumptions that have governed Western military strategy for 3 decades, and several of those assumptions just failed publicly, visibly, and in ways that cannot be walked back. Atching that dollar for dollar was never realistic, so Iran didn't try. Instead, it built something different. Military analysts call it an asymmetric deterrence architecture, a system designed not to win a conventional war, but to make the cost of fighting one unacceptably high for the adversary. What that looks like in practice is this: a network of ballistic missiles with steadily improving range and precision, drone technology that was partly reverse engineered from American assets captured in the region, proxy forces embedded across Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen who could be activated to open multiple fronts simultaneously, and a domestic missile development program that moved faster and got further than Western intelligence agencies were willing to publicly admit. The Iranians weren't building an army to fight America. They were building a system to deter America, and to punish any adversary that decided deterrence wasn't enough. The United States stepped into this architecture not as a neutral observer, but as a direct participant. American naval assets have been positioned across the region. American air power has been used inside Iranian territory. American intelligence and logistics have been provided to Israeli military campaigns in ways that go well beyond passive support. Washington entered this conflict as a co-belligerent, whatever the official framing said, and that decision, made by people in comfortable offices far from the battlefield, set the conditions for everything that followed. Here is the event that will be studied in war colleges for years. Iranian forces launched a precision strike on what international reporting has identified as the operational headquarters of Mossad in Tel Aviv. Let that register for a moment. Not a symbolic target, not an empty building designated as a political statement. The nerve center of Israeli intelligence, the facility that houses operational command infrastructure, communication systems, surveillance networks, and the people responsible for planning the most complex covert operations in the world. One of the most secured, most hardened, most heavily defended facilities in all of Israel, and Iran hit it. The military implications alone are significant. But the deeper story is what this strike says about Israeli air defense. Israel's Arrow system is not an ordinary missile defense platform. It is one of the most technically advanced interceptor systems ever built, designed specifically to engage ballistic threats at high altitude before they reach their targets. The entire concept is that threats like this get destroyed in space before they become a problem on the ground. Arrow didn't stop this missile. Arrow didn't intercept this strike. And that single fact changes the strategic calculus for every government that has been quietly relying on the assumption that advanced missile defense systems make high-value targets safe. If Mossad's headquarters, surrounded by every layer of Israeli and American air defense technology, can be struck with precision, then no fixed facility anywhere in the region can be considered reliably protected. That's not analysis specific to Israel. That's a conclusion that defense planners in every NATO capital are now sitting with. The systems they've invested billions in, the systems they've built their force protection assumptions around, have just been publicly demonstrated to have gaps that a regional power with patience and investment can exploit. The uncomfortable reality is that the assumptions Western militaries built their strategies on are being tested in real time, and not all of them are holding. The strike also carried a psychological dimension that pure military analysis misses. Mossad's headquarters represented something beyond its physical function. It represented Israeli institutional invincibility, the idea that Israel's intelligence apparatus was beyond reach. Iran didn't just damage a building, it punctured a myth, and in conflict, myths matter. They shape morale, they shape recruitment, they shape the confidence of allies. The message delivered to every government watching was unmistakable. No institution, no matter how formidable its reputation, is beyond reach. The Tel Aviv strike didn't happen in isolation. It was one element of a coordinated, multi-wave missile campaign that regional security analysts are describing as qualitatively different from anything Iran has previously executed. The scale was larger, the coordination was tighter. The timing of launches was structured to overwhelm early warning systems in specific sectors, rather than simply to maximize the number of missiles in the air. This was not volume for the sake of volume. This was operational architecture, a deliberate attempt to saturate and sequence past defense systems rather than simply challenge them. What drew the most attention from analysts, though, wasn't the scale. It was what Iran chose to use. Defense experts reviewing the available data have identified what they're describing as a new category of missile, systems that Western intelligence agencies have either not fully catalogued or have been unable to accurately characterize in their public assessments. These aren't upgraded versions of known Iranian weapons. They represent something sufficiently distinct that the analytical community is still working through what exactly was deployed. Iran, for its part, made a deliberate choice not to identify the specific systems used. In military circles, that's not just a communication decision. That is itself a strategic weapon. When your adversary cannot fully characterize what you just used against them, they cannot build reliable countermeasures. They cannot confidently brief their defense contractors. They cannot accurately tell their political leadership what the threat picture looks like going forward. Ambiguity about capability is force multiplication without firing another shot. Iran understood this and used it deliberately. Iran's military spokesperson also made a point of publicly claiming the strikes, a significant departure from the ambiguity that has historically characterized Iranian military communication. For decades, Iran preferred to operate in the gray zone, supporting operations, enabling proxies, maintaining plausible deniability. This time, Iran stepped into the light and said clearly, "We did this." That behavioral shift tells you something critical about where Iranian leadership believes it stands. This was not the communication of a state trying to de-escalate. This was the communication of a state making a permanent statement about its capabilities and its willingness to use them. The conflict stopped being a regional story the moment Iranian forces engaged American military assets directly. Surveillance drones operated by U.S. forces in the area of the Strait of Hormuz came under Iranian engagement. One was shot down, confirmed not just by official accounts, but by footage that circulated internationally before any government communications office had time to manage the narrative. The drone's identity added a layer of irony that was not lost on analysts. The surveillance asset in question was modeled on technology that Iran had originally reverse-engineered from an American drone captured in the region years earlier. The United States, in a roundabout way, had been operating a descendant of technology Iran derived from American hardware, and Iran destroyed it over the Strait of Hormuz, the single most strategically consequential body of water in global energy economics. Between 20 and 30% of the world's seaborne oil transits through that passage depending on market conditions. A waterway that narrow, that critical, is not just a geographic feature. It is a pressure point for the entire global economy. Iran shooting down an American surveillance drone over that passage is a territorial and strategic declaration. This space is contested, and we are willing to demonstrate that contestation publicly and on camera. Reports of American helicopter losses followed, at least one confirmed, with additional accounts still being verified at time of writing. And then came the report that carries the most severe escalatory weight of anything that has emerged from this conflict so far. Accounts suggesting that American flight crew members may have been forced down in Iranian-controlled territory. Some of these accounts have been verified, others remain unconfirmed. But the possibility alone reshapes the entire strategic picture. Captured American military personnel on Iranian soil is not a news story. It is a national crisis. It transforms a military confrontation into a hostage situation. It gives Iran a form of leverage that cannot be neutralized through airstrikes or economic pressure. It creates a domestic political emergency in the United States that transcends party lines and forces a reckoning that no administration wants to navigate, especially in a divided political environment. And it raises questions about force deployment decisions, about intelligence failures, about who authorized what and when, that will echo through congressional hearings, legal proceedings, and electoral campaigns for years. While the battlefield was shifting, something equally significant was happening 3,000 miles away in Washington. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth initiated the removal of senior military leadership, including the Army Chief of Staff, in the middle of an active military engagement. Sit with that for a moment. The United States Army's senior uniformed commander was replaced while American forces were under fire in a live conflict. This is not a normal event. In the history of American civil-military relations, there are very few precedents for replacing top uniformed leadership during active operations, and the reason it happened matters enormously. Multiple sourced accounts indicate that the removed officers were not removed for battlefield failure. They were removed because they were asking uncomfortable questions, specifically because the Army chief had made his view known, privately but clearly, that American forces were being committed to a conflict structured around Israeli strategic objectives rather than American national interest. That assessment, whatever its military merits, was apparently politically untenable. The signal this sends inside the institution is devastating in ways that don't show up in any battlefield report. Junior officers and mid-grade commanders now understand, with complete clarity, that speaking institutional truth to political power can end a career regardless of how accurate that truth is. The officers who remain know what happened to the ones who didn't stay quiet. That knowledge changes behavior. It changes what gets said in briefings. It changes what gets reported up the chain. It changes what advice political leadership actually receives versus what those leaders think they're receiving. Operational effectiveness doesn't collapse immediately when this kind of fracture happens, but it degrades. Quietly, gradually, and in ways that only become visible when the next critical decision is made on the basis of advice that was shaped by self-preservation rather than honest professional judgment. The people watching this development most carefully were not in Tel Aviv or Tehran. They were in Beijing and Moscow, in every capital that has spent the last decade calculating whether American military power is as coherent and reliable as its hardware suggests. An America that fires its senior military commanders mid-conflict for disagreeing with civilian policy preferences is not projecting strength, it is projecting internal dysfunction. And that is information that adversaries and potential adversaries file and use. Here's the insight that most mainstream coverage consistently misses about what Iran just did. None of this was reactive. Iran didn't wake up last month and decide to build a missile program. Iran didn't improvise this campaign in response to recent provocations. What you are watching is the activation of a strategic system that Iran began constructing approximately 2 decades ago. When the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, Iranian leadership watched carefully and drew specific lessons. The speed with which American conventional forces dismantled Saddam Hussein's military confirmed that fighting the United States conventionally was a path to rapid defeat. When NATO operations in Libya in 2011 removed the Gaddafi government, Iran watched that too, and noticed how quickly a state without external deterrence could be dismantled once Western powers decided it was time. When Syria descended into civil conflict, Iran didn't just observe, it intervened strategically. Not to win the Syrian civil war per se, but to use the chaos as a construction zone, building influence networks, positioning forces, developing the logistical and operational infrastructure of a proxy deterrence architecture across the entire northern arc of the Middle East. The missile program running alongside all of that was not a reaction to any single event. It was a deliberate long-term investment in a specific strategic capability, the ability to hold high-value targets at risk across the region, regardless of what any adversary's air defense architecture looked like. Iran's planners understood 20 years ago that there would eventually be a scenario requiring them to simultaneously deter both Israeli military power and American military power. They built a system for exactly that scenario. What we are watching right now is not improvisation. It is execution. And here is the part that Washington's foreign policy establishment finds genuinely difficult to acknowledge openly. The system is working, not perfectly. Iran is absorbing significant pressure, significant economic pain, significant military attrition on its proxy forces, but the core architecture is functioning within parameters its designers intended. America is in a conflict where its air defense partnerships are being publicly tested and found wanting, where its drone surveillance infrastructure is being degraded, where its senior military leadership has just been fractured by internal political pressure, and where its domestic political consensus is visibly breaking apart. Iran, meanwhile, maintains the posture of a state that is not defeated, not deterred, and not running low on options. That asymmetry between American strain and Iranian operational continuity is the strategic reality that most coverage doesn't want to say plainly. America entered this conflict with certain assumptions about the diplomatic environment that have not survived the opening months of serious escalation. The expectation was that traditional alliance structures, NATO, Gulf partnerships, bilateral relationships with European powers, would hold under pressure the way they held during previous episodes of American military engagement. They have not held in the way Washington anticipated. European governments are facing a dual pressure that is proving politically unmanageable. Energy prices across the continent have risen sharply as market uncertainty over Hormuz transit and regional stability feeds into commodity pricing. And European civilian populations, watching the scale of the military campaign and the civilian consequences flowing from it, have moved in ways that constrain what European political leadership can do without paying a domestic political price. The result is that several European governments have put distance between themselves and American policy in language that would have been almost unthinkable during the post-9/11 period of alliance cohesion. NATO as an institution has not formally aligned behind American military operations in this theater. That is a departure from patterns that defined Western security cooperation for 30 years. The Gulf picture is even more complicated. Qatar hosts significant American military infrastructure, air bases, command facilities, logistical assets that are genuinely central to American power projection in the region. Qatar also found itself facing a strike on its desalination infrastructure during this period. Iran publicly denied responsibility, pointing instead toward American and Israeli involvement. Whether that attribution was accurate matters less than the message it delivered to Gulf governments. Your proximity to American military operations creates vulnerability for you, and we are prepared to demonstrate that vulnerability when it serves our purposes. That message was heard. Several Gulf governments are now, at minimum, quietly reassessing the terms of their security relationships with Washington, not abandoning them publicly, but inserting distance and uncertainty in ways that complicate American operational planning. Iran has effectively made this conflict expensive for enough third parties that a growing number of governments are privately applying pressure on Washington to find an exit path. Energy market disruption affects everyone. Regional instability affects trade, investment, and the calculations of every sovereign wealth fund in the Gulf. The erosion of Gulf state confidence in American protection affects the entire architecture of petrodollar recycling that underpins American financial interests in the region. None of these are military victories for Iran, but collectively they represent a strategic achievement of genuine significance, the transformation of what Washington wanted to frame as a limited bilateral military operation into a conflict with distributed costs and growing pressure from multiple directions for de-escalation. Underneath the strategic architecture, something else is happening that matters just as much. In Israel, the social contract that has historically sustained public support for military campaigns is showing fractures that Israeli political history makes genuinely unusual. Protests are not occasional or marginal. They are sustained, large, and increasingly centered, not on the periphery of Israeli politics, but on mainstream voices, calling directly for the removal of Prime Minister Netanyahu. In a country with a documented history of remarkable social cohesion during periods of military conflict, a country where the pressure of external threat has repeatedly pulled political factions together, sustained mass protest of this scale and duration is a meaningful signal. The political foundation beneath the government is less stable than the government's public posture suggests. In the United States, the numbers are harder to ignore. Protests against American military involvement have drawn crowds that, in aggregate across major cities, number in the millions. 10 million people in the streets is not a fringe political event. It is an electoral reality. Every senator and congressman facing a ballot in the coming cycle is calculating right now how this issue will play in their district, their state, their donor base. The generals who were fired for saying American forces shouldn't be further committed to this conflict were not just expressing institutional military judgment, they were accurately reading a domestic political environment that any honest analyst can see. When the people in uniform are saying the same thing as the people in the streets, that convergence is not something political leadership can afford to dismiss indefinitely. The economic dimension threads through all of it. Markets have responded to the uncertainty of this conflict with the behavior markets always exhibit when confronted with risks they cannot fully price. Volatility, flight towards safe haven assets, dollar pressure, and commodity disruption. Gold has moved sharply upward. Oil prices have behaved in ways that translate directly into what families pay at the pump, what small businesses pay for fuel and transport, what households across 3 continents pay to heat their homes. Economic pain of this kind is not abstract. It is felt. And it will be remembered when people decide whether the governments that made these decisions deserve to keep their jobs. Strip away the framing on all sides. Remove the political spin from Washington, the propaganda from Tehran, the managed narrative from Jerusalem. What you are left with is this. America entered this conflict carrying a set of assumptions, and several of those assumptions have not survived contact with the reality of the conflict they were supposed to govern. The assumption that Iranian missile capability could be significantly degraded before it posed a genuine threat to high-value targets has been tested and found wrong. The assumption that Israeli air defense architecture, backed by American technology, would contain the overwhelming majority of Iranian strikes has been tested and found incomplete. The assumption that traditional alliance structures, NATO, Gulf partnerships, European bilateral relationships, would hold under sustained military pressure has been tested and found optimistic. The assumption that domestic political support in the United States could be maintained at the necessary intensity through the duration of the campaign has been tested and is visibly eroding. None of that means America loses this conflict. Military situations are fluid, American industrial and military capacity is genuinely formidable, and diplomatic channels, even between the most hostile parties, rarely close entirely. But it does mean that the path forward is not the path that was planned. And there is a particular kind of strategic danger that attaches to departing from your plan mid-conflict while your military leadership is in internal flux, while your domestic political support is fragmenting, while your adversary is demonstrating capabilities you didn't fully anticipate, and while the economic consequences of continued engagement are spreading to third parties who are now applying pressure for an exit. The removal of senior military commanders during active operations sends a signal that travels much further than Washington. In Beijing, in Moscow, in every capital that has spent years quietly recalculating whether the American security guarantee is as solid as its hardware implies, what they see is an America that is powerful but internally divided, militarily capable but politically strained, globally engaged but strategically uncertain. That is the geopolitical portrait being painted in real time, and the audience watching most carefully is not in any of the countries directly involved. Iran has not won this conflict. Let that be clearly stated. Iran is absorbing costs, economic, military, human, that are not trivial. But Iran has demonstrated something that now permanently changes the strategic environment of this century. A regional power, starting from a position of conventional military inferiority, built a system over 20 years that has imposed costs on the most powerful military in the world, exceeding what that military's political leadership anticipated, publicly degraded the myth of Israeli intelligence invulnerability, strained the alliance structures that underpin American global power projection, and forced a domestic political reckoning in the United States that is reshaping the electoral calculations of every politician in the country. That is an achievement of strategic significance that will be analyzed, replicated, and iterated upon by every government that has ever worried about American military pressure landing on their doorstep. The next moves, whether diplomatic backchannels finally produce an off-ramp, whether the military situation escalates into something that forces decisions no one currently wants to make, whether captured American personnel become the crisis that reshapes everything, will define whether this conflict expands into the kind of confrontation that restructures the global order, or whether the accumulated pressure on all sides finally creates the conditions for an exit that no one will be willing to call a victory. History doesn't hand you clean endings. It hands you turning points, and then it demands that you figure out in real time which one's actually turned. We may be living inside one of those moments right now. The question isn't whether anyone is paying attention. The question is whether the right people, the ones with the authority to make decisions that will determine what happens next, are learning the right lessons fast enough to matter. Before you go, I want to know what you think. Because on a situation this complex, the conversation in the comments often gets closer to the truth than anything on cable news. Do you believe American political leadership fully understood the risks of direct military engagement with Iran before this escalated? Or was this a strategic miscalculation that could have been avoided with different decision-making? And second, Iran has deliberately framed this as a global conflict, not a regional one. Has watching these events unfold changed how you think about American foreign policy in the Middle East? Drop your answer below. I read every comment. Like and subscribe if you want to stay ahead of how this develops, and hit the bell so you don't miss what comes next.